I still remember the exact moment my world collapsed. It wasn't when Dave actually got me fired. It was 3 days before, when I caught a glimpse of his laptop screen during a team meeting. There in plain text was an email draft addressed to our division head, Sarah Winters. My name was in the subject line, concerns regarding Thomas Bennett's project management. I only saw those few words before Dave quickly minimized the window, flashing me that same artificial smile he'd been wearing for weeks. But those few words were enough to send ice through my veins. The meeting continued around me while my mind raced, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. Dave and I had been colleagues for 4 years. We'd gone for drinks after work. I'd invited him to my home for my daughter's birthday party last summer, for God's sake. Tom, did you want to add anything about the quarterly projections? My manager's voice pulled me back to reality. No, I think we've covered everything. I managed to reply, my voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor I felt inside. That night, I couldn't sleep. The image of that email subject line floated in my mind like a malevolent specter. I tried dismissing it as normal workplace politics. Maybe Dave was just expressing legitimate concerns about one of my projects. But deep down, I knew better. The secretive way he'd closed the window, the artificial cheerfulness that had replaced our previously easy rapport, the whispered conversations with other team members that would abruptly end when I approached. Something was happening, and I was the target. The next morning, I arrived at the office early, determined to confront Dave directly. We'd been friendly colleagues for years. Surely we could discuss this like adults. But his desk remained empty until our 10 a.m. status meeting, where he sat across the conference table, avoiding eye contact. After the meeting, I followed him to the break room. Dave, got a minute? I kept my voice casual. Actually, I'm pretty swamped today, Tom. He barely looked up from the coffee machine. It'll just take a second. I positioned myself by the door, not exactly blocking it, but making it awkward for him to leave without being rude. I noticed something on your laptop yesterday. Were you drafting an email about me to Sarah? His face flushed, but he recovered quickly. Just some project notes. Nothing important. The subject line mentioned concerns about my project management. Dave's expression hardened slightly. Look, Tom, I'm not comfortable discussing this. If you have concerns about how I communicate with leadership, you should talk to HR. The calculated coldness in his voice confirmed my fears. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was deliberate. And mentioning HR wasn't a suggestion, it was a warning. I just thought colleagues who respect each other would discuss issues face-to-face first. I said, trying to keep the hurt from my voice. We're not in college, Tom. This is business. He pushed past me, our shoulders brushing in the doorway. I stood alone in the break room, the coffee machine gurgling in the background. The betrayal felt physical, like a punch to the gut. Dave and I had climbed the ranks of Meridian Tech together. When my father died 2 years ago, he had organized the office collection for flowers and covered 3 of my client meetings so I could take time off. What had changed? Over the next 2 days, I tried to focus on my work while discreetly watching for signs of what might be happening behind the scenes. I noticed Dave having lunch with Ryan from the executive floor. Unusual, since Ryan rarely mingled with anyone below director level. I saw hushed conversations between Dave and Melissa, who had been gunning for the same promotion I was currently being considered for. Then came Friday morning. I was summoned to a meeting room to find Sarah Winters sitting with Garrett from HR. Their expressions told me everything before a single word was spoken. Thomas, please have a seat, Sarah said, gesturing to the chair across from them. The next 30 minutes were a carefully orchestrated execution. Concerns had been raised about my management of the Acceleron project. Data showed deadlines had been missed. Several team members had reported communication issues. The preliminary budget I'd submitted contained significant errors. I tried defending myself. The Acceleron deadlines had been adjusted with the client's approval. The communication issues were due to a new project management system I'd been asked to test. The budget errors were actually contingency allocations I'd clearly labeled in the accompanying notes. But I could tell from their expressions that my fate had already been decided. This meeting wasn't for discussion, it was for documentation. Given these concerns and your inability to acknowledge them, we feel it's best to part ways. Today will be your last day. Sarah's voice was professionally sympathetic but firm. Who raised these concerns? I asked, though I already knew. We can't discuss that. Garrett interjected smoothly. But this decision reflects input from multiple stakeholders. They handed me a severance package. 3 months' salary in exchange for signing a non-disparagement agreement. Garrett would escort me to collect my personal items, and my access would be terminated immediately. I sat there stunned as the reality crashed over me. 8 years at Meridian Tech, ended in a half-hour meeting based on twisted half-truths. As I walked back to my desk with Garrett shadowing me, I passed Dave's workspace. He was studiously focused on his monitor, but I caught the slight twitch of his lips. Not quite a smile, but something disturbingly close to it. That night, I sat in my darkened apartment, a glass of bourbon in my hand, staring at nothing. The shock had given way to a hollow emptiness. I texted my girlfriend Ellie asking for space tonight. I couldn't face explaining what had happened, not yet. My phone periodically lit up with her concerned messages, but I couldn't bring myself to respond. The severance would keep me afloat for a few months, but the tech industry in Boston was tight-knit. References mattered. Word traveled. And something in my gut told me this wasn't over, that whatever Dave had put in motion wouldn't stop at merely getting me fired. I was right. The first hint came 3 days later when a recruiter who had previously been enthusiastic about placing me suddenly claimed the position had been filled. The second came when an old colleague at Visionary Software warned me over drinks that someone was asking questions about my work ethic. By the end of the week, I'd had 3 promising interviews canceled with vague excuses. Someone was blacklisting me, systematically closing doors before I could even approach them. It took me 2 weeks and calling in a favor from a college friend who now worked at Meridian's HR to confirm what I already suspected. Dave had not only orchestrated my firing, but was actively sabotaging my job prospects. My friend couldn't access the specific content, but she confirmed that Sarah Winters had sent emails regarding me to at least 4 major tech companies in the area. Responses to reference inquiries that had mysteriously been directed to her rather than to my direct supervisor. The betrayal crystallized into something harder, colder. This wasn't just office politics. This was personal destruction. Dave hadn't just wanted my job or the promotion. He wanted me ruined. That night, I finally told Ellie everything. We sat on my couch as I poured out the whole ugly story, my voice occasionally breaking with anger and humiliation. "But why would he do this?" she asked, her face flushed with indignation on my behalf. "What does he gain by continuing to hurt you after you're already gone?" The promotion I was up for would have put me above him in the hierarchy. I explained. But it's more than that. I think he's afraid I'll land somewhere better and eventually be in a position to affect Meridian. The tech world is small. Competitors hire from each other all the time. "That's sociopathic," Ellie whispered, "to deliberately destroy someone's livelihood like that. It's calculated," I said, the hollow feeling in my chest hardening into something else entirely. "And he's winning." The next morning, I woke up with clarity I hadn't felt since before the firing. Anger had replaced shock, and with it came focus. I opened my laptop and began methodically documenting everything. Dates, times, conversations, the pattern of canceled interviews. I created a spreadsheet of everyone from Meridian who might know what happened, categorizing them by their likely loyalty to Dave or potential willingness to help me. Then I started researching Dave himself. We'd been colleagues, not friends, despite the occasional social interaction. I realized how little I actually knew about him beyond workplace pleasantries. That was about to change. I spent the next week building a detailed profile. LinkedIn gave me his career history. Facebook showed his social connections. Instagram revealed his hobbies and hangouts. Twitter exposed his professional ambitions through the industry leaders he followed and engaged with. I discovered his wife ran a moderately successful interior design blog, and his brother worked for a competing tech firm. He lived in a recently purchased colonial in Cambridge that, based on public records, appeared to stretch his financial resources. Most importantly, I learned he had joined the board of the Massachusetts Technology Council, a prestigious industry group that could significantly advance his career. His social media suggested this appointment meant everything to him. It was his pathway to the executive level he clearly coveted. While I gathered information, I continued applying for jobs, but now with a wider geographical net. If I couldn't work in Boston's tech scene, I would look elsewhere. My savings were dwindling, and pride was a luxury I couldn't afford. After 3 brutal months of rejections, I finally landed an interview with Nexalon, a mid-sized tech firm in Philadelphia. The position was a step down from my role at Meridian, but I was in no position to be picky. I prepared meticulously, and the interview went well until the final minutes. "Just one concern," said the hiring manager, a woman named Janet who had seemed impressed with me until that moment. "We received some feedback about your departure from Meridian Tech. Something about missed deadlines and budget mismanagement?" My heart sank. Even here, hundreds of miles away, Dave's poison had spread. "Those allegations were misleading," I said carefully. "The Acceleron project had client-approved timeline adjustments, and the budget allocations were clearly documented. I'd be happy to walk you through the actual details. Janet's expression remained polite but had cooled noticeably. That won't be necessary. We'll be in touch if we decide to move forward. They never called back. 2 days later, I hit rock bottom. My bank account was dangerously low, and I'd started applying for retail positions. That night, I sat on my apartment floor surrounded by past due notices, a half-eaten container of leftover takeout beside me. I'd told Ellie I needed to work on job applications, but the truth was I couldn't bear for her to see me like this. Broken, humiliated, defeated. My phone rang. Unknown number. Hello? I answered, not bothering to hide the weariness in my voice. Is this Thomas Bennett? A woman's crisp professional tone. Yes, it is. This is Imani Jackson from Catalyst Digital. I understand you're in the market for a new position. I straightened up, heart suddenly racing. Catalyst Digital was an up-and-coming tech consultancy based in New York City, known for innovative work and a selective hiring process. Yes, I am, though I haven't applied to Catalyst. I quickly brushed takeout crumbs from my shirt, as if she could somehow see me through the phone. We don't always wait for applications, Mr. Bennett. Your work on the Acceleron platform's UX architecture caught our attention. We have a position that might interest you, though it would require relocation to New York. The conversation lasted 20 minutes. By the end, I had a formal interview scheduled for the following Monday in New York City. As I hung up, I felt a spark of hope for the first time in months, but it was tempered with caution. I'd had promising leads before, only to have them evaporate once Dave's sabotage reached them. I couldn't let that happen again. For this opportunity, I needed to change tactics. I called Ellie and told her about the interview, and she insisted on helping me prepare. The next day, she came over with a bottle of wine and a determination that brought tears to my eyes. We need to address the Meridian situation head-on, she said as she paced my living room. Hiding from it makes it look like you have something to hide. If I bring it up first, I control the narrative. I agreed, the strategy becoming clear. Exactly. And we need to make sure whatever reference checking they do bypasses Sarah Winters and goes to people who will actually be honest. We spent hours crafting the perfect approach, how I would proactively discuss my departure from Meridian, focusing on the documented facts without sounding bitter or accusatory. I prepared a portfolio showing the Acceleron project's actual performance metrics and client communications that contradicted the concerns used to fire me. Most crucially, I reached out to 2 former managers who had left Meridian before the incident and asked if they would serve as references. Both agreed readily, having always appreciated my work. The interview in New York was intense. 6 hours of technical questions, scenario discussions, and meetings with various team members. But I was prepared. When the inevitable question about Meridian came up during my conversation with the director of operations, I was ready. I want to address my departure from Meridian proactively, I said, maintaining steady eye contact. I was terminated following concerns about project management that I believe were mischaracterized. I've brought documentation showing the actual project outcomes and communications, and I've provided references from previous supervisors who can speak to my work. While I could have handled certain aspects of the situation more effectively, I've learned valuable lessons about communication and office dynamics that would benefit my work here at Catalyst. The director studied me thoughtfully. I appreciate your candor, Thomas. We've all had professional setbacks. How we respond to them often tells more about us than the setbacks themselves. 2 days later, I received an offer from Catalyst Digital, Senior Solutions Architect, with a salary that matched what I'd made at Meridian. The position required relocation to New York City within 3 weeks. I accepted immediately. Moving to New York was a frantic blur of apartment hunting, packing, and saying goodbye to Boston, the city where I'd built my adult life. Ellie and I had difficult conversations about attempting a long-distance relationship. We agreed to try, though we both recognized the challenges ahead. My new role at Catalyst was demanding but exhilarating. The company culture valued innovation and results over office politics, and I threw myself into the work with renewed purpose. For the first time in months, I wasn't defined by my firing or consumed by thoughts of Dave's betrayal, but I didn't forget. In quiet moments late at night in my small Manhattan apartment, I would sometimes open a special folder on my laptop, the one containing all my research on Dave, Meridian Tech, and the circumstances of my dismissal. I continued adding to it occasionally, checking Dave's social media profiles or noting news about Meridian from industry publications. It wasn't yet a plan for revenge. It was more like tending a garden of possibility. 6 months into my new position, I received an unexpected opportunity. Catalyst had landed a major contract with FinSecure, one of the largest financial technology companies in the country, and I was assigned to lead our side of the collaboration. The project would significantly raise my profile within the industry and came with a substantial performance bonus. I was determined to excel, not just for my career, but because success would be the first step toward eventually balancing the scales with Dave. The FinSecure project was challenging and high profile. For 3 months, I worked 14-hour days, coordinating teams across multiple time zones and solving complex integration problems that had stumped previous attempts. When we successfully launched the platform 2 weeks ahead of schedule, FinSecure's CTO personally acknowledged my contribution during the executive briefing. That recognition led to more opportunities. By the end of my first year at Catalyst, I'd been promoted to Director of Enterprise Solutions, managing a team of 15 architects and developers. My salary had increased by 30%, and I'd been featured in a tech industry publication highlighting rising talents in financial technology integration. Ellie and I had struggled with the distance, eventually deciding to end our romantic relationship but remaining close friends. The breakup had been painful but amicable, and in some ways it freed me to focus completely on rebuilding my career and position in the industry. As my professional reputation grew, I began carefully rebuilding my network within Boston's tech community. LinkedIn connections were accepted, discreet messages exchanged, drinks arranged when business brought me back to the city. I never mentioned Dave directly, but I would occasionally ask casual questions about Meridian. Through these conversations, I learned that Dave had indeed received the promotion he'd wanted, the one he'd eliminated me to secure. He was now Meridian's Director of Product Innovation, reporting directly to Sarah Winters. His appointment to the Massachusetts Technology Council had led to speaking engagements at industry conferences and quotes in trade publications. From the outside, he appeared to be thriving. The knowledge burned in my chest, a constant smoldering ember. But I also learned something interesting. Meridian was struggling. Their stock had dropped 15% over the past year, and they'd lost several key clients to competitors. The Acceleron platform that I'd helped architect had suffered from poor updates and integration issues since my departure. While Dave was personally advancing, the company that had enabled his rise was faltering. This information became another entry in my growing folder of research. Not yet a weapon, but potential ammunition. In my second year at Catalyst, we expanded rapidly. My team doubled in size, and I was traveling frequently to establish new client relationships and oversee complex implementations. During a conference in Chicago, I encountered Sarah Winters unexpectedly in the hotel lobby. She recognized me immediately, her expression shifting from surprise to professional neutrality. Thomas, it's been a while. Her handshake was firm but brief. Sarah. I maintained eye contact, my voice steady. I hear Meridian's having some challenges with the Acceleron platform. A flicker of discomfort crossed her face. Every company faces technical hurdles occasionally. Of course, though sometimes those hurdles could be avoided with the right expertise. I smiled slightly. Catalyst would be happy to offer consultation services if needed. The subtle reminder that I was now positioned at a successful competitor, one that could potentially help solve problems her company was facing, landed exactly as intended. Sarah made a vague comment about being late for a panel and quickly walked away. It was a small moment, but deeply satisfying. The first time I directly confronted anyone from Meridian since my firing. It wouldn't be the last. 3 months later, an opportunity arose that would change everything. FinSecure, impressed with Catalyst's work, was acquiring a controlling interest in our company. The acquisition would dramatically expand our resources and client base, and the integration process would create new leadership positions within the combined entity. I was invited to interview for the role of Vice President of Enterprise Architecture, which would oversee all technology integration efforts across both companies. It represented a massive leap in responsibility, compensation, and industry influence. The interview process was grueling. 7 rounds with various executives, technical assessments, leadership evaluations, and finally a presentation to the combined executive committee about my vision for the integrated architecture. Throughout, I emphasized not just technical expertise, but strategic thinking and the ability to build effective teams across organizational boundaries. 2 weeks of anxious waiting followed before I received the call. The position was mine. At 35 years old, I had become a vice president at one of the most influential financial technology companies in the world, with a compensation package that exceeded my wildest expectations. That night, alone in my apartment, I opened the special folder on my laptop and began to consider possibilities that had previously seemed like fantasy. With my new position came connections, influence, and resources that could potentially be leveraged toward a very specific goal. For the first time, I began to formulate an actual plan rather than just collecting information. The FinSecure acquisition of Catalyst was finalized 3 months later. As Vice President of Enterprise Architecture, I was now responsible for a combined team of over 100 technologists and a substantial operational budget. My first priority was successfully integrating the two companies' systems and teams, a high-visibility task that would cement my position in the new hierarchy. I threw myself into the work with calculated intensity, building relationships across both organizations and developing a reputation as a decisive but fair leader. When the integration proved successful, coming in under budget and ahead of schedule, my standing within FinSecure solidified further. It was time to begin phase one of what I now thought of as the restoration. Not revenge precisely, but a restoration of balance and truth. I started by reconnecting with more former Meridian colleagues, now positioned as a potential employer rather than a desperate job seeker. Over coffee meetings and industry events, I selectively rekindled relationships, particularly with talented individuals who had reason to be dissatisfied with Meridian's current direction. One such person was Angela Zhao, a brilliant systems architect who had worked under me on the original Acceleron project. I arranged to meet her when business brought me to Boston, suggesting drinks at an upscale bar near Meridian's offices. "I won't lie, Tom, things aren't great there," she confided after we'd caught up on personal matters. "The Acceleron platform is barely holding together. Dave keeps pushing for flashy new features to impress the board, but he won't allocate resources to fix the fundamental integration issues." "That's disappointing to hear," I said, signaling the bartender for another round. "Acceleron had such potential. The clients know it too. We've lost 3 major accounts in the past 6 months." She lowered her voice. "There are rumors of layoffs coming." I nodded sympathetically. "How are you positioned if that happens?" Angela shrugged. "Dave and I have never gotten along. He thinks I'm too attached to the architecture you designed." She gave me a meaningful look. "Which I am because it worked. Have you considered other options?" I asked carefully. "FinSecure is always looking for talented architects." Her eyes widened slightly. "Are you offering me a job, Tom?" "I'm suggesting that when you're ready to explore options, you should call me first." I handed her my business card. "We have some projects that would benefit from someone with your particular expertise." Over the next 2 months, I had similar conversations with 4 other key Meridian employees. By the 3rd month, Angela and 2 others had joined FinSecure, bringing with them intimate knowledge of Meridian's current projects and internal challenges. This wasn't just about recruiting talent, though that was certainly beneficial to FinSecure. It was about gradually, systematically removing the supports that made Dave successful. Each person I hired away had been essential to maintaining the increasingly fragile systems he claimed credit for developing. Phase 2 involved more direct market positioning. With my new authority at FinSecure, I directed our sales team to specifically target Meridian's vulnerable client accounts. We developed proposals that addressed the exact pain points Angela and the others had identified in Meridian's implementations: the integration issues, the reliability problems, the feature over function priorities that Dave had instituted. Within 6 months, we had successfully poached 2 of Meridian's largest remaining Acceleron clients. The industry took notice. FinSecure was ascendant, and Meridian was increasingly being perceived as a company in decline. I monitored Dave's social media during this period, watching as his posts shifted from triumphant announcements of new features to more defensive messaging about upcoming improvements and renewed focus on client satisfaction. His speaking engagements became less frequent. His quotes in industry publications all but disappeared. The Massachusetts Technology Council, that prestigious board position he had coveted so deeply, announced its annual rotation of members. Dave's name was conspicuously absent from the renewed list. Phase 3 required more patience and subtlety. Through my growing network of industry connections, I arranged to meet Gregory Harmon, the CEO of Venture Tech Partners, a private equity firm with a significant ownership stake in Meridian. The pretext was exploring potential collaboration opportunities between FinSecure and some of Venture Tech's other portfolio companies. We met for lunch at an exclusive Manhattan restaurant, spending the first hour discussing general market trends and opportunities. Gregory was sharp, analytical, and clearly concerned about maximizing returns for his investors, When the conversation eventually turned to specific companies, I carefully steered it toward Meridian. I've noticed some interesting movements in their client base recently. I observed casually. Several major accounts shifting to competitors. Gregory's expression tightened slightly. The tech sector is always competitive. Of course, I agreed. Though sometimes client migration points to deeper issues. I worked at Meridian earlier in my career. Led the original Acceleron architecture team, in fact. His interest visibly sharpened. Did you? That was their flagship product for several years. It was built with scalability and integration as core principles. I explained, which makes the current implementation problems particularly unfortunate. Huh. What implementation problems? Gregory's tone had shifted from conversational to concern. I presented the information as objective industry analysis rather than personal grievance. The documented client complaints, the technical limitations of recent updates, the growing gap between Meridian's marketing promises and delivered functionality. All information I had accumulated through former colleagues in competitive analysis, presented factually but devastatingly. Their director of product innovation, Dave Simmons, I believe, seems to prioritize new features over architectural integrity. I concluded, it's a common mistake, but particularly damaging in financial technology where reliability is paramount. Gregory was silent for a moment, studying me. Why are you telling me this, Thomas? I met his gaze openly. Because I respect what venture tech does, and I believe in transparency within the industry. The conversations we've been having about potential collaboration deserve a complete picture of all relevant factors. He nodded slowly, clearly recalibrating his understanding of both me and Meridian. I appreciate your candor. Perhaps we should schedule a follow-up discussion about some of these technical details. I'd be interested in your perspective on how these issues might be addressed. We parted with a firm handshake and a commitment to meet again soon. As I walked back to my office, I felt a calm satisfaction. No lies had been told, only strategic truths revealed to someone positioned to act on them. 2 weeks later, industry news reported that VentureTech was sending in a consultant team to evaluate Meridian's operations and product development strategies. A month after that, Sarah Winters resigned as division head, accepting a position at a smaller competitor. The dominoes were falling, though not yet directly on Dave. But his protective cover was eroding, layer by layer. The final phase began 9 months after my promotion to vice president. FinSecure's growth and successful integration of Catalyst had positioned us to consider additional acquisitions. Our CEO, Rebecca Chen, had assembled a task force to identify potential targets that would strengthen our market position and technical capabilities. We need companies with strong foundational architecture, but current leadership challenges. Rebecca explained during our planning session, situations where our management approach could quickly improve performance and market position. I had anticipated this moment and prepared accordingly. I have a suggestion that meets those criteria exactly. I said, sliding a folder across the conference table. Meridian Technologies. Strong core products, significant market share, but declining performance and client retention. The folder contained a detailed analysis of Meridian's financial position, technical assets, client relationships, and organizational vulnerabilities. All meticulously compiled from public sources, industry analysis, and the insights gleaned from former Meridian employees now working at FinSecure. Rebecca raised an eyebrow as she reviewed the documents. You've done your homework, Thomas. I believe in thorough analysis. I replied evenly. Meridian stock has fallen 30% in 18 months. Their market capitalization makes them affordable now, but their technical foundation and client relationships still have substantial value. With proper leadership, they could be successfully integrated into our ecosystem. The discussion continued for 2 hours, with various executives raising questions and concerns that I had anticipated and prepared for. By the end, there was cautious consensus. Meridian would be added to our short list of acquisition targets for serious consideration. Over the next 3 months, I provided additional analysis and strategic planning to support the potential acquisition. I was careful not to appear overeager, balancing my advocacy for Meridian with objective assessment of other targets. When Rebecca ultimately decided to move forward with exploratory talks with Meridian and one other company, it seemed like the natural conclusion of a thorough evaluation process rather than my orchestrated campaign. FinSecure's initial overture to Meridian was made through appropriate channels, CEO to CEO with involvement from VentureTech, whose concerns about Meridian's current trajectory made them receptive to acquisition discussions. I was deliberately kept in the background during early negotiations. My connection to Meridian noted, but not emphasized. The process accelerated when VentureTech actively began pressuring Meridian's board to consider the offer seriously. FinSecure's proposal included retaining Meridian's core technical team, but implementing significant leadership changes to address operational inefficiencies and product development challenges. 3 months of intense negotiation culminated in an agreement. FinSecure would acquire Meridian Technologies in a deal valued at $375 million, a substantial amount, but significantly less than what the company had been worth 2 years earlier. The announcement sent ripples through the industry, with analysts generally praising the strategic fit while noting Meridian's recent struggles. As the integration planning began, Rebecca called me into her office. "Thomas, I want you to lead the technical integration team for Meridian," she said without preamble. "You know their systems better than anyone else here, and your work on the Catalyst integration was exemplary." I maintained a thoughtful expression, as if considering the responsibility carefully. "There's my history with the company to consider. Some might see a conflict of interest." Rebecca waved this away. "That's exactly why you're the right person. You understand their architecture at a fundamental level, and frankly, your perspective on where they've gone wrong technically will be invaluable in correcting course." I nodded slowly. "In that case, I'd be honored to lead the integration." "Excellent. You'll work directly with their current leadership during the transition period. I believe their director of product innovation is," she glanced at her notes, "David Simmons. He'll report to you throughout the integration process." "David Simmons," I repeated, keeping my voice neutral. "Yes, I'm familiar with his work." As I left Rebecca's office, I allowed myself a moment of private satisfaction. After 3 years of methodical effort, everything had aligned precisely as I'd envisioned. Dave didn't yet know it, but his professional fate now rested entirely in my hands. The first integration planning meeting was scheduled for the following week at Meridian's headquarters in Boston. I spent the intervening days reviewing the final acquisition documents and preparing a comprehensive integration strategy that would showcase both my professional capabilities and highlight the areas where Meridian had faltered under current leadership. When the day arrived, I traveled to Boston with a small team of FinSecure executives. Walking into Meridian's offices for the first time since my unceremonious departure 3 years earlier produced a strange sense of detachment, as if I were observing my own emotions from a distance. The same security desk, the same elevator banks, even some of the same faces among the employees we passed. Yet everything felt fundamentally changed. We were escorted to the main conference room where Meridian's leadership team waited. And there, seated midway down the table with a forced smile frozen on his face, was Dave Simmons. Our eyes met briefly as I entered the room. His expression flickered. Confusion, then recognition, then something approaching dread before he composed himself. He hadn't known. That much was immediately clear. The acquisition had been negotiated at higher levels, and no one had thought to mention to Meridian's director of product innovation that the man he had once betrayed and destroyed was now returning as his superior. Meridian's acting CEO opened the meeting with a tense welcome, doing his best to present the acquisition as a positive development despite the obvious anxiety in the room. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and addressed the group with professional courtesy. "For those who don't know me, I'm Thomas Bennett, Vice President of Enterprise Architecture at FinSecure. I'll be leading the technical integration of our companies." I allowed my gaze to move around the table, resting momentarily on Dave before continuing. "Some of you may remember that I worked at Meridian earlier in my career. That experience gives me a unique appreciation for the foundation and potential of your technology, as well as insight into where enhancements might be beneficial." Dave shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes now fixed on the table before him. "Over the next few weeks, I'll be meeting individually with each department head to discuss integration plans and organizational alignment. My goal is to preserve what works well while implementing necessary changes to restore growth and client confidence." The word restore hung in the air like a promise or a threat, depending on one's perspective. After the general session, we broke into smaller groups for specific discussions. I deliberately left Dave's session for last, spending the day in productive meetings with other department heads, many of whom seemed relieved to finally have clear direction after months of uncertainty. At 5:30 p.m., Dave entered the small conference room I'd been using, closing the door behind him. His earlier confusion had hardened into wary defensiveness. "Thomas," he remained standing, though I gestured to a chair. "This is unexpected." "Is it?" I leaned back slightly, studying him. Life has a way of coming full circle sometimes. "Look, about what happened," I raised a hand, cutting him off. "This isn't a personal meeting, Dave. It's a professional evaluation of product innovation strategies and how they'll align with FinSecure's roadmap. His relief was palpable. He thought this was going to be strictly business, that I was maintaining professional distance rather than seeking retribution. Of course, he said, finally taking a seat. I've prepared a presentation on our current development initiatives and planned features. Before we get to that, I said, opening a folder on the table, I'd like to discuss the Acceleron platform's performance over the past 3 years, specifically the client attrition and integration challenges that began shortly after my departure. Dave's expression tightened. Those issues stem from multiple factors: market conditions, changing client requirements, and architectural compromises made to accommodate rushed feature additions. I finished for him features that were prioritized over stability and scalability. The board wanted innovation. The board wanted sustainable growth, I corrected. They got declining revenues and client complaints instead. I laid out the evidence methodically. The technical debt that had accumulated under his leadership, the promises made to clients that couldn't be fulfilled, the talented team members who had left or been pushed out when they raised concerns. This pattern of prioritizing short-term optics over long-term stability ends now. I concluded, FinSecure has different expectations for technical leadership. Dave's facade of professional confidence had cracked, revealing the anxiety beneath. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that your current role will not exist in the new organizational structure. We'll be implementing a different approach to product development with separate leadership for innovation strategy and technical architecture. You're firing me. His voice was flat. Not immediately, I replied. There will be a 90-day transition period during which you'll assist with knowledge transfer and documentation of current projects. After that, yes, your position will be eliminated. Dave leaned forward, desperation edging into his tone. This is because of what happened before. This is personal. I met his gaze steadily. Every decision I've made is documented and justified by objective business criteria. The acquisition team conducted thorough due diligence on Meridian's operations and leadership effectiveness. The findings supported organizational changes to address demonstrated performance issues. I can talk to Rebecca Chen, explain my vision directly. Rebecca approved this restructuring plan yesterday. I closed the folder and stood up. I'll need your completed project documentation by the end of next week. Angela Zhao will be your primary contact for the knowledge transfer process. The mention of Angela, one of the talented employees I'd recruited away from Meridian months earlier, now returning as part of the acquisition team, was the final twist of the knife. Dave understood now that this hadn't been a sudden opportunity for revenge. It had been a methodically executed strategy unfolding over years. You destroyed my career, he said quietly, anger finally breaking through his professional veneer. No, Dave, I replied, gathering my materials. I evaluated your performance based on objective metrics and made appropriate business decisions. The exact approach you claimed to be taking 3 years ago. I walked to the door, then paused. One more thing. The non-disparagement agreement that Meridian had me sign as part of my separation? It only applied to Meridian as a separate entity. Now that we're one company, different legal standards apply. Remember that during your transition period, I left him sitting there, the implications of his situation settling over him like a shroud. He now faced exactly what he had once inflicted: professional displacement, reputation damage, and uncertain future prospects. Only in his case, it was based on his actual performance failures rather than manufactured concerns. As I walked through Meridian's offices toward the elevator, I felt a strange sense of completion. The journey that had begun with that glimpse of an email draft on Dave's laptop had come full circle. I had lost everything, rebuilt from nothing, and ultimately risen to a position where I could ensure that truth and consequences aligned properly. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. It was restoration of balance, of professional integrity, of the natural order where actions eventually reveal character and produce appropriate results. The next day I returned to New York and my ongoing responsibilities at FinSecure. The Meridian acquisition would require months of careful integration work, but the critical pivot point had been achieved. Dave would depart, the technical architecture would be rebuilt according to sound principles, and the company would find its proper place within our organizational structure. In the quiet of my office that evening, I closed the special folder on my laptop for the final time. The information it contained had served its purpose and was no longer needed. The balance had been restored. 3 years after being fired and blacklisted, I had become my betrayer's boss's boss, and he was about to be jobless. Dave's transition period began the following Monday. I had returned to New York, delegating daily oversight of the Meridian integration to my trusted team members, with regular video conferences to maintain strategic direction. I could have micromanaged the process, could have been physically present to witness Dave's daily humiliation as his authority dwindled, but that would have been petty. The systematic dismantling of his professional standing required no emotional indulgence on my part. Angela Zhao, now our senior systems architect, reported to me daily on the knowledge transfer process. Her updates were clinical and precise, but occasionally revealed glimpses of the atmosphere at Meridian. Dave tried to justify the Acceleron architecture changes to the team today, she noted during one call. Claimed they were necessary for competitive reasons. Jason from your FinSecure team asked for the market analysis that supported those decisions, and Dave couldn't produce anything substantive. How did he respond? I asked, maintaining professional curiosity rather than satisfaction in my tone. He got defensive, then tried to shift blame to management pressures from Sarah Winters. Angela paused. It didn't go over well. Most of the room knew Sarah left months ago, partly because of the technical decisions he'd pushed through despite her concerns. These reports continued for 2 weeks, Dave alternating between desperate attempts to justify his past decisions and increasingly transparent efforts to position himself for a role in the new organizational structure. According to Angela, he had taken to lingering after meetings, engaging team members in conversations that inevitably turned to his valuable institutional knowledge and unique client relationships. No one was biting. By the 3rd week, his strategy shifted. Angela reported he had begun scheduling one-on-one meetings with key technical staff, ostensibly to provide detailed knowledge transfer, but actually using the time to subtly undermine the integration process. He told Marcus that FinSecure would likely move all development offshore once the integration is complete. Angela said, frustration evident in her voice. He's trying to create uncertainty and fear. Document these conversations. I instructed. Have Marcus and anyone else who's experienced this write down what was said as specifically as possible. When I had 5 such documented incidents, I scheduled a video call with Dave and Meridian's interim HR director. My expression was professionally concerned as Dave's face appeared on the screen. Dave, some concerning reports have reached me about your communications with team members. It appears you've been sharing speculation about FinSecure's intentions that contradicts our official integration communications. His expression flickered between defensiveness and calculation. I've simply been honest with my team about market realities. They deserve transparency during this uncertain time. Transparency comes from authorized communications, not personal speculation, I replied evenly, particularly when that speculation contradicts the documented integration plan and appears designed to create anxiety among team members we hope to retain. The HR director, Patricia, interjected. Dave, this behavior could be construed as violation of the transition agreement you signed, which explicitly prohibits actions that could negatively impact employee retention or client relationships. I watched comprehension dawn on his face. The transition agreement included a significant severance package, one that would be voided by documented violations. I was merely trying to prepare my team for all possibilities, he said, his tone now conciliatory. Perhaps I could have chosen my words more carefully. Indeed, I agreed. Going forward, please restrict your communications to factual knowledge transfer. Any questions about the integration process or future organizational structure should be directed to the appropriate integration team members. Of course, he said, the forced smile I remembered so well plastered across his face. Just trying to be helpful. Your most helpful contribution will be complete and accurate documentation of current projects and systems. I reminded him, that's where your focus should remain for the duration of your transition period. After ending the call, I received a private message from Patricia. Classic damage control behavior. We'll monitor closely. I replied with a simple acknowledgement, but inwardly I recognized Dave's tactics all too well. When direct authority failed, he resorted to manipulation and undermining. The same approach he had used to orchestrate my downfall was now being deployed in a desperate attempt to salvage his position. The difference was that this time, his target was prepared and positioned to counter every move. By the 5th week of the transition, Dave's behavior had shifted again. According to reports from the integration team, he had become scrupulously correct in his documented communications, while becoming increasingly absent. He attended required meetings but contributed minimally, submitted requested documentation that was technically complete but lacked critical context, and spent most of his time behind closed doors in his office. He's searching for his next position, Angela speculated during our weekly call. Word is he's had at least 3 lengthy phone conversations with contacts at competing firms. That's his right, I responded, as long as he's fulfilling his transition responsibilities. Minimally, she confirmed. But there's something else. Marcus noticed that Dave's been accessing historical project files that aren't relevant to his current documentation task. Files from the Acceleron launch period. When you were still here, my interest sharpened. What specifically? Client communications, original architecture documents, budget approvals, mostly materials from about 3 months before you left. The implication was clear. Dave was searching for material he could use to justify his past actions, perhaps to potential employers, perhaps as leverage in some form. He was looking for evidence that would support his version of events from 3 years ago. Ensure all file access is logged, I instructed. He's entitled to review materials needed for his knowledge transfer responsibilities, but monitor for any unusual download patterns or external communications containing proprietary information. The following week brought the development I had been anticipating. Patricia requested an urgent call with me, her expression grave when she appeared on my screen. Thomas, we've detected potentially serious policy violations by Dave Simmons. She began without preamble. Our IT security team flagged unusual email activity from his account. He's been sending company documents to a personal email address. What type of documents? I asked, though I suspected the answer. Technical specifications, client communications, and internal emails from 3 years ago, specifically related to the Acceleron project development and your departure from Meridian. I nodded thoughtfully. Has the legal team reviewed this activity? Yes. Their assessment is that this constitutes a clear violation of both his employment agreement and the transition terms. Several of the documents contain proprietary information that would be valuable to competitors. What do they recommend? I kept my tone neutral, professional. Immediate termination without the remainder of the severance package. They're preparing the documentation now and wanted your approval as the integration lead. I considered briefly. Dave had self-destructed faster than I had anticipated, driven by desperation to secure his next position and perhaps to protect his version of past events. His actions had violated explicit company policies and contractual agreements. The decision was clear-cut from a business perspective. I agree with legal's assessment, I said. However, I'll need to recuse myself from direct involvement in the termination process, given my history with Meridian and Mr. Simmons. Please coordinate with Rebecca Chen for final approval. Patricia nodded. I'll handle it appropriately. For what it's worth, the evidence is unambiguous. This isn't a judgment call. Document everything thoroughly, I advised. Mr. Simmons may contest the termination. After the call ended, I sat quietly in my office absorbing the implications. Dave's final act at Meridian would be self-sabotage, violating policies to secure documents he likely hoped would protect his professional reputation, only to have those very actions destroy his last remaining professional protection. There was a certain symmetry to it. 2 days later, Angela called to inform me that Dave had been escorted from the building that morning. His company accounts had been deactivated, and his personal items would be shipped to his home address. The transition documentation he had been responsible for would need to be completed by others on the team, but they had anticipated this possibility and prepared accordingly. How did he take it? I asked, curious despite myself. Angela hesitated. Not well. He claimed he was being set up, that the whole acquisition had been orchestrated specifically to target him. She paused. He mentioned you by name, said you had manipulated everything from the beginning as revenge. I see. I kept my voice neutral. Were these accusations documented? Patricia recorded the entire termination meeting. Standard procedure for situations like this. Another pause. He was irrational by the end. Security had to be called when he refused to surrender his access badge. I thanked Angela for the update and ended the call, reflecting on how completely Dave had fulfilled my assessment of his character. When confronted with the consequences of his own actions, he had constructed a narrative of persecution rather than accepting responsibility. The same pattern he had exhibited 3 years ago when questioned about his email to Sarah Winters had played out again, only with more dramatic results. The following week brought the final chapter of Dave's professional unraveling. Through industry contacts, I learned he had interviewed with 3 competitors, all of whom had subsequently declined to move forward with his candidacy. The circumstances of his departure from Meridian, violation of confidentiality policies, and misappropriation of proprietary information had become known within the tight-knit Boston tech community. What he had once done to me, professional destruction and industry blacklisting, had ultimately befallen him instead, not through my direct action, but through the inevitable consequences of his own character and choices. The Meridian integration proceeded smoothly after Dave's departure. We rebuilt the Acceleron architecture according to the original scalable design principles, incorporating new technologies where appropriate, but maintaining the foundational elements that had made it successful initially. Client confidence began to return as system stability improved and promised features were actually delivered. 3 months after the acquisition was finalized, FinSecure hosted a celebration at Meridian's Boston offices, now rebranded as FinSecure's Enterprise Innovation Center. Rebecca Chen attended, making her first visit to the Boston location since the acquisition. After her formal address to the assembled employees, she sought me out. "The integration has exceeded expectations, Thomas," she said, champagne glass in hand. "The client retention numbers are particularly impressive. We anticipated losing at least 15% during the transition, but we've kept all but 3%. The product fundamentals were always strong," I acknowledged. "They just needed proper implementation and support." Rebecca studied me thoughtfully. "You know, when we first considered acquiring Meridian, there were concerns about your history with the company, whether personal feelings might influence your judgment." I met her gaze steadily. "Every decision I've made has been based on business metrics and technical assessments. The documentation supports that." "Absolutely," she agreed. "That's precisely my point. You've been rigorously professional throughout this process, even when dealing with complicated personnel situations." She didn't mention Dave by name, but her meaning was clear. "I appreciate your confidence," I said simply. Rebecca nodded, then changed the subject to upcoming strategic initiatives. The matter of my history with Meridian and Dave Simmons had been addressed and dismissed, a professional concern that had been satisfactorily resolved. Later that evening, as the celebration wound down, I found myself alone in what had once been Meridian's executive conference room, the same room where I had been informed of my termination 3 years earlier. The furnishings had been updated, the walls repainted with FinSecure's corporate colors, but the dimensions and view remained the same. I stood by the window overlooking Boston's financial district, the city lights shimmering against the early evening darkness. Through the glass, I could see my reflection, Vice President of Enterprise Architecture at one of the most respected financial technology companies in the country, overseeing a successful integration that would advance my career even further. In that moment, I felt a curious emptiness, not dissatisfaction exactly, but a sense of completion that left me wondering what would drive me forward now. For 3 years, the methodical pursuit of professional restoration had focused my energies and decisions. That chapter was now conclusively closed. Dave Simmons had been removed from his position, his industry reputation damaged perhaps beyond repair. The company that had enabled his betrayal had been absorbed into mine, its valuable assets preserved, while its flawed leadership had been replaced. The balance had been restored. Yet as I stood there, I realized that restoration wasn't the same as healing. I had achieved everything I had set out to accomplish, but the process had changed me in ways I was only beginning to recognize. The months that followed brought new challenges and opportunities. FinSecure continued its growth trajectory, and my role expanded to include oversight of technology strategy across all acquired entities. I traveled frequently, dividing my time between New York, Boston, and other locations where we maintained significant operations. My professional reputation soared. I was invited to speak at industry conferences, quoted in business publications, approached by executive recruiters with increasingly prestigious opportunities. I maintained cordial professional relationships but few close friendships, having learned the value of emotional distance in protecting oneself from betrayal. I occasionally thought about Dave, wondering what had become of him. Industry gossip suggested he had left Boston, unable to secure appropriate employment in the tech sector there. Some said he had taken a significantly reduced position with a startup in Austin. Others claimed he had left technology entirely. I made no effort to confirm these rumors, content to let that chapter remain closed. 6 months after the Meridian integration was completed, I received an unexpected LinkedIn message from Sarah Winters, my former division head, who had authorized my termination 3 years earlier. She was now in a senior position at a West Coast firm and was visiting New York for a conference. She suggested meeting for coffee to catch up on industry developments. I considered declining but ultimately agreed, curious about her perspective now that our relative positions had shifted so dramatically. We met at an upscale cafe near my office, exchanging professional pleasantries before addressing the unspoken tension between us. "I owe you an apology, Thomas," Sarah said finally, setting down her coffee cup. "The situation with your departure from Meridian. I handled it poorly." I studied her carefully. "In what way?" "I accepted Dave's characterization of your performance without sufficient independent verification," she admitted. "He presented selective evidence that appeared compelling at the time, but in retrospect, I should have conducted a more thorough investigation." "Why didn't you?" I kept my tone neutral, genuinely interested in her rationale. Sarah sighed. "Expediency, partly. We were under significant pressure to improve quarterly numbers, and Dave positioned your removal as a quick path to enhancing performance metrics." "And did it?" I asked, though I knew the answer. "Temporarily. The next quarter looked better because Dave slashed costs and made splashy announcements about new features. 6 months later, everything began to unravel as those decisions proved unsustainable." She shook her head. "By then, I was already feeling the consequences of other shortcuts I'd authorized." My resignation wasn't entirely voluntary. We sat in silence for a moment, the ambient cafe noise filling the space between us. "For what it's worth," Sarah continued eventually, "watching how you've handled the Meridian acquisition has been educational. You could have pursued a scorched earth approach, but instead you preserved what was valuable and made changes based on demonstrable performance issues. That was the responsible business approach." I said simply. "Yes, it was." She smiled slightly. "And the irony that Dave's position was eliminated based on actual documentation of his performance failures isn't lost on me." I acknowledged this with a slight nod, but offered no further comment. "Have you heard anything about him recently?" Sarah asked, her tone carefully casual. "Nothing specific," I replied truthfully. "Industry rumors suggest he's struggling to rebuild. He reached out to me last month," she revealed. "Wanted me to serve as a reference for a position he was pursuing in Seattle. I declined." "Because of his performance at Meridian?" I asked. "Partly that, mainly because of how he handled the aftermath of his termination." Sarah met my gaze directly. "He blamed everyone but himself. Refused to acknowledge any responsibility for decisions that objectively damaged the company. That level of self-deception is concerning in an executive." I nodded, recognizing that Sarah had learned from her experience just as I had from mine. As we concluded our meeting, Sarah extended her hand. "I'm glad things have worked out for you, Thomas. Truly." I accepted the handshake with professional courtesy. Life has a way of finding balance eventually. Walking back to my office, I reflected on the strange circular journey that had brought me to this point. Sarah's acknowledgement of her error in judgment provided a form of closure I hadn't realized I still needed. Not vindication, I had achieved that through my own efforts, but recognition from someone who had participated in my professional destruction that the foundation for it had been flawed. 2 weeks later, I received another unexpected communication, an email from Dave Simmons himself. The subject line was simply "Request to meet," and the message was brief. "Thomas, I'm sure you have no desire to hear from me, but I'm requesting 30 minutes of your time when you're next in Boston. There are matters I'd like to address in person rather than by email. Regards, David Simmons." My first impulse was to delete the message without response. What possible benefit could come from meeting with the man who had orchestrated my professional destruction and then self-destructed when the tables turned? Yet curiosity lingered. What would Dave say after everything that had transpired? What could he possibly hope to achieve? After careful consideration, I replied with equal brevity, "Dave, I will be in Boston next Thursday and Friday. I can spare 30 minutes at 4 p.m. on Thursday at the Regent Hotel lobby bar." Il Fournileur, Thomas Bennett. The Regent was a neutral location, public enough to ensure professional behavior, while still allowing for private conversation. I would be flying back to New York immediately afterward, providing a natural endpoint to the interaction. When Thursday arrived, I found myself unusually distracted during my meetings at the Boston office. The prospect of facing Dave again, this time without professional pretense or organizational buffers, occupied my thoughts more than I cared to admit. I concluded my business efficiently and arrived at the Regent precisely at 4, securing a quiet corner of the lobby bar where we could speak without being easily overheard. Dave arrived 15 minutes late, offering no apology for his tardiness. The physical change in him was immediately apparent. The confident executive polish had faded. His suit was still decent quality but slightly ill-fitting, as if he had lost weight since purchasing it. His face showed new lines of stress, and the practiced charm that had once been his professional signature was noticeably diminished. "Thomas," he said, sliding into the seat across from me, "thank you for agreeing to meet. You said you had matters to discuss." I replied, deliberately not offering any social niceties. "What are they?" Dave ordered a scotch from the passing server before responding. I noticed his hands had a slight tremor. "I wanted to meet face to face." He began, his tone carefully modulated, "to acknowledge that my actions toward you at Meridian were professionally inappropriate." I said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "The situation with your termination and subsequent difficulties was not handled according to proper business protocols." He spoke as if reciting practiced lines. "I wanted to express my regret for any professional hardship that resulted." The carefully constructed non-apology was exactly what I should have expected. Acknowledgement of inappropriate actions without actual admission of deliberate harm, expression of regret for hardship without accepting responsibility for causing it. "Is that all?" I asked, my voice neutral. Dave shifted uncomfortably. "I was hoping we could discuss putting the past behind us. The technology sector is small, and our professional paths may cross again." Now the actual purpose emerged. Dave wasn't seeking reconciliation, he was attempting damage control. Having failed to secure appropriate employment in Boston and finding his reputation damaged beyond his ability to repair independently, he was trying to neutralize what he perceived as the source of his problems. Me. "Let me understand," I said, watching him carefully. "You orchestrated my termination based on misrepresentations, actively sabotaged my employment prospects afterward, and now that similar circumstances have befallen you through your own actions, you're seeking what? Forgiveness? Professional neutrality?" "I'm trying to be reasonable," Dave replied, a hint of his old defensiveness emerging. "What happened at Meridian was business, not personal. We both made decisions based on our professional interests." "No, Dave," I corrected him calmly. "You made decisions based on personal ambition disguised as professional concern. I made decisions based on documented performance metrics and policy violations." "That's your interpretation," he said, but the objection lacked conviction. "It's the interpretation supported by evidence," I replied. "The same evidence that led to your termination without severance and subsequent difficulty securing appropriate employment." Dave's expression hardened. "So that's it? You've had your revenge, and now you'll continue to block my career advancement at every opportunity?" The accusation was so disconnected from reality that I almost laughed. "I haven't taken any action regarding your career since the documented policy violations that led to your termination. Your current professional challenges stem from your own decisions and their natural consequences. You engineered the entire acquisition to target me," he insisted, his voice rising slightly. "You spent years planning my destruction." I studied him with clinical interest, recognizing the desperate narrative he had constructed to avoid confronting his own responsibility. In his mind, his failures couldn't be the result of his own actions. They had to be the product of elaborate machinations by someone else. "Dave," I said quietly, "FinSecure acquired Meridian because it represented good business value despite deteriorating performance under current leadership. Every decision was documented, reviewed by multiple executives, and approved through proper channels. Your position was eliminated based on objective assessment of your results and organizational needs." "Convenient justifications," he muttered, but his conviction was wavering. "The same justifications you claimed when orchestrating my removal," I pointed out. "The difference is that mine are supported by actual documentation rather than manufactured concerns." We sat in silence for a moment, the ambient noise of the hotel lobby filling the space between us. Dave stared into his scotch, his reflection distorted in the amber liquid. "What do you want from me, Thomas?" he finally asked, his voice quieter. "What would it take to move past this?" The question caught me off guard. It hadn't occurred to me that Dave might view me as holding power over his future, beyond the natural consequences of his own actions. The idea that I might be actively impeding his career revival was, ironically, giving me more credit than I deserved. "I don't want anything from you," I replied honestly. "I haven't been taking any action regarding your career since your termination. Your professional reputation is yours to rebuild, or not, based on your actions moving forward." He looked up, clearly skeptical. "You expect me to believe you have no intention of hindering my job prospects if contacted for references?" If asked directly about our professional interaction, I would provide factual responses based on documented events, I said, but I have neither the time nor the inclination to proactively involve myself in your career trajectory. Dave studied me for a long moment, perhaps trying to detect deception. Finding none, his shoulders slumped slightly. So that's it, he said, more statement than question. Years of career building, undone by a few poor decisions. Actions have consequences, I replied simply. As I discovered 3 years ago, he flinched slightly at the reminder. What did you do? He asked suddenly. After Meridian, how did you rebuild? The question seemed born of genuine curiosity, perhaps even desperation for a blueprint he could follow. I started over, I told him, relocated to a new market, took a position below my experience level, focused exclusively on delivering measurable results rather than office politics, built new professional relationships based on demonstrated performance rather than networking. And that worked? His tone was doubtful. Eventually, I confirmed, though the process was neither quick nor easy. Dave nodded slowly, finishing his scotch in a single swallow. I should go, he said, standing abruptly. Thank you for your time. I remained seated, watching as he walked away, his posture still carrying echoes of the confident executive he had once been, now layered with the uncertainty of a man facing an unfamiliar landscape of diminished prospects. As I flew back to New York that evening, I reflected on the strange symmetry of our meeting. 3 years ago, I had sat stunned and devastated as Dave's machinations destroyed my career. Today, I had sat composed and established as he confronted the wreckage of his own. The reversal was complete, the balance restored. Yet I felt no triumph, no vindication, only a quiet certainty that justice, however delayed, had eventually found its course. The following months brought continued professional success. FinSecure expanded into new markets, and my role evolved to include strategic oversight of emerging technologies and potential acquisition targets. I was promoted to Executive Vice President of Technology Strategy, reporting directly to Rebecca Chen and participating in board-level decisions about the company's future direction. My personal life, however, remained relatively sparse. The intensity of focus that had driven my professional resurrection had left little room for developing deep personal connections. I dated occasionally but maintained emotional distance, unwilling to risk vulnerability. My apartment in Manhattan was elegantly appointed, but felt more like a high-end hotel suite than a home, a place to rest between periods of work rather than a sanctuary of personal comfort. This imbalance became increasingly apparent as my professional goals were achieved and surpassed. The driving force that had propelled me through the past 3 years, the need to restore professional standing and balance the scales with Dave, had been satisfied. What remained was the question of what would define my life moving forward. The answer began to emerge unexpectedly. 6 months after my meeting with Dave, I was asked to speak at a technology leadership conference in Chicago. My presentation on integrating acquired technologies while preserving core architectural integrity was well received, leading to conversation with other attendees during the subsequent networking reception. That was a refreshingly honest assessment of acquisition challenges, said a voice beside me as I collected a drink from the bar. Most executives pretend the process is smoother than it actually is. I turned to find a woman in her late 30s observing me with intelligent interest. Her name badge identified her as Dr. Julia Reeves, Chief Research Officer at a healthcare technology company I recognized but had never directly engaged with. Experience has taught me that acknowledging difficulties leads to better solutions than pretending they don't exist, I replied, a surprisingly uncommon perspective in corporate leadership. She noted a hint of wry amusement in her tone. Most prefer the nothing-to-see-here approach until problems become too significant to ignore. Our conversation continued through the reception and into dinner, ranging from technical architecture principles to broader philosophical questions about technology's role in society. Julia's background included both computer science and bioethics, a combination that gave her unique insight into the human implications of technological advancement. The question isn't just whether we can build something, she observed as we discussed AI applications in healthcare, but whether we should and how implementation affects human dignity and autonomy. Most tech executives don't incorporate ethics as a design principle, I noted. Most tech executives haven't seen the human consequences of their design decisions up close, she countered. I spent 3 years in clinical settings before moving to technology development. It changes your perspective when you watch patients interact with systems designed by people who never considered their real-world circumstances. The evening ended with an exchange of contact information and a tentative plan to continue our conversation when business brought either of us to the other city. I returned to New York, finding myself thinking about Julia's perspectives more than I had anticipated. Not just her professional insights, but the values that informed them. 2 weeks later, I had reason to be in Chicago for meetings with a potential acquisition target. I messaged Julia, suggesting dinner if her schedule permitted. Her affirmative response included a restaurant recommendation away from the downtown business district, somewhere we can actually hear each other without shouting over networking attempts. That dinner led to regular communication, initially focused on professional topics, but gradually expanding to include personal interests and experiences. When Julia had reason to visit New York 3 months later, I found myself unexpectedly nervous about seeing her again, a reaction I hadn't experienced in years. Our relationship evolved gradually, neither of us rushing given the geographical distance in our demanding careers. But something about Julia broke through the careful emotional barriers I had constructed. Perhaps it was her straightforward honesty, so different from the calculated office politics I had grown accustomed to navigating. Perhaps it was her integration of professional excellence with clear ethical foundations. Whatever the reason, I found myself more open with her than I had been with anyone since before the Meridian incident. 6 months into our relationship, during a weekend Julia was visiting New York, I finally shared the complete story of what had happened with Dave and Meridian. Not just the professional outcomes, but the emotional devastation, the methodical rebuilding, and the ultimate restoration of balance. We sat on my apartment balcony overlooking the city, the evening air cool against our skin as I recounted the journey of the past 4 years. Julia listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful. "That explains a lot," she said when I finished. "The walls you built, the caution in allowing people close to you. Betrayal like that changes how you see professional relationships. It was necessary protection at the time," I acknowledged. "But is it still?" she asked gently. "Those walls protected you during rebuilding, but now they're limiting what you can experience. I've watched you in professional settings. You're respected, even admired, but always at a distance." Her observation was uncomfortably accurate. I had achieved professional restoration, but remained emotionally isolated, protected but disconnected. The walls became habitual, I admitted. After focusing so completely on professional restoration, I'm not sure I remember how to build a life that includes more. Julia's hand covered mine on the balcony railing. Perhaps that's the next challenge then. Not just restoring what was taken, but expanding beyond it to build something new. That conversation marked a turning point, not just in our relationship, but in my approach to life beyond professional achievement. With Julia's perspective helping me recognize patterns I had been too close to see, I began the slow process of dismantling the protective barriers that had served their purpose, but now confined me. As our relationship deepened, we navigated the practical challenges of distance and demanding careers. Video calls became a daily ritual. Weekends were carefully coordinated to maximize our time together. After a year of this arrangement, we began discussing more permanent solutions. The decision crystallized unexpectedly during a leadership retreat for FinSecure executives. Rebecca Chen announced her intention to establish a significant innovation center focused on healthcare financial technology, a growing sector that represented substantial opportunity for the company. The new division would require a leader with both technical architecture expertise and strategic vision. "We're considering Chicago as the location," Rebecca explained during our executive briefing. "Centrally positioned for client access, strong technical talent pool, lower operational costs than New York, and proximity to several major healthcare systems for partnership opportunities." The potential alignment was immediately apparent. A leadership role in Chicago would advance my career while closing the geographical gap with Julia. When I expressed interest in the position, Rebecca was supportive but curious. "It would be a lateral move in terms of organizational hierarchy," she pointed out, "though the healthcare focus would add new dimensions to your experience." "Sometimes value isn't measured solely by hierarchical advancement," I replied. "Building something significant in a growth sector offers different rewards." Rebecca studied me with the perceptive insight that had made her an effective CEO. "This wouldn't have anything to do with your increasingly frequent trips to Chicago, would it?" I smiled slightly, unsurprised by her awareness. "It's a factor in my interest, yes, but the professional opportunity stands on its own merits." She nodded thoughtfully. "Life balance matters, Thomas. You've driven yourself relentlessly since joining FinSecure. Perhaps it's time for integration rather than just achievement." 3 months later, I relocated to Chicago to establish FinSecure's Healthcare Innovation Center. Julia and I found an apartment midway between my new office and her research facility, our first shared home, filled with a mixture of our previously separate lives. The professional challenge of building a new division from the ground up was substantial but rewarding. I assembled a team that combined FinSecure veterans with healthcare technology specialists, creating an environment where different perspectives strengthened our solutions rather than creating conflict. The work was meaningful in ways my previous roles hadn't been. Financial technology had always been intellectually stimulating, but healthcare applications connected our innovations directly to human well-being. Developing systems that improved patient financial experiences while enhancing provider operations offered tangible impact beyond profit margins and market share. As the division established itself and began to thrive, I found myself reflecting on the long, strange journey that had brought me to this point. The devastating betrayal by Dave had set in motion a sequence of events that, despite their initial catastrophic impact, had ultimately led to greater professional success and personal fulfillment than I might otherwise have achieved. This realization crystallized one evening as Julia and I walked along Chicago's lakefront, discussing potential collaboration between FinSecure's healthcare division and her research team. The conversation flowed seamlessly between professional possibilities and personal observations, an integration that would have been impossible for me to achieve years earlier. "You seem different lately," Julia noted, her hand warm in mine despite the cool evening breeze. "More present, less guarded." I considered this assessment. "I think I've finally stopped defining myself in relation to what happened at Meridian," I admitted. "For years, even after achieving professional restoration, I was still the person who had been betrayed and had managed to overcome it. Now I'm just me, building something new rather than replacing what was taken." "That's significant growth," she observed. "Revenge and restoration can be powerful motivators, but they're ultimately backward-looking. Creation and connection point forward." Her insight resonated deeply. The methodical pursuit of balance with Dave had driven me to rebuild my career to greater heights than before, but it had also kept me emotionally tethered to the past. True freedom had come not from the professional restoration I had achieved, but from eventually moving beyond it to create a life defined by new priorities and connections. 2 years after relocating to Chicago, I received an email notification that Dave Simmons had viewed my LinkedIn profile. Curious, I checked his own profile and discovered he had recently started a new position as a product manager at a mid-sized software company in Denver. A significant step down from his director-level role at Meridian, but a legitimate professional position nonetheless. In the past, this information might have triggered complex emotions, perhaps satisfaction that he remained diminished professionally, perhaps concern that he was rebuilding despite his actions. Instead, I found myself simply acknowledging the update with detached interest before moving on to more immediately relevant matters. Later that evening, I mentioned the LinkedIn notification to Julia as we prepared dinner in our apartment. "Does it bother you?" she asked, studying my expression. "Seeing him rebuilding his career?" I considered the question honestly. No, I realized his professional journey isn't relevant to mine anymore. Whatever consequences he continues to experience from his past actions are between him and his own choices. Julia nodded, passing me the cutting board of vegetables for the stir-fry we were preparing. That's what real closure looks like. Not the absence of memory, but the absence of emotional charge when the memory surfaces. As we cooked together, discussing plans for an upcoming weekend trip to Michigan wine country, I reflected on how completely my focus had shifted. The restoration of professional standing and balancing of accounts with Dave had once consumed my entire attention. Now those achievements had become simply one chapter in a continuing story rather than its defining plot. The following spring, FinSecure's Healthcare Innovation Center won a major industry award for our patient financial experience platform. The recognition brought attention from healthcare systems nationwide and positioned us for significant expansion. During the same period, Julia received a substantial research grant to explore ethical applications of artificial intelligence in clinical decision support, a project that would elevate her professional standing while addressing issues she cared deeply about. We celebrated our dual achievements with a weekend getaway to a lakeside cottage, taking rare time away from our professional responsibilities to simply enjoy each other's company and the natural beauty surrounding us. Sitting on the dock at sunset, watching light play across the water, I found myself experiencing a depth of contentment that had once seemed unattainable. I was thinking, Julia said, her head resting against my shoulder, about how different paths lead to unexpected destinations. "What do you mean?" I asked, my arm around her waist. "If Dave hadn't betrayed you at Meridian, you wouldn't have rebuilt in New York. If you hadn't rebuilt in New York, you wouldn't have been positioned for the FinSecure opportunity. If you hadn't succeeded at FinSecure, you wouldn't have led the Meridian acquisition or ultimately moved to Chicago. She turned slightly to meet my gaze. And we wouldn't be here now. The observation was startlingly accurate. The devastating betrayal that had once seemed like the worst moment of my professional life had set in motion the sequence of events that led to my greatest professional achievements and most meaningful personal connection. So in a way, I said slowly, I should be grateful to Dave for his betrayal. Julia smiled slightly. I wouldn't go that far. What he did was still fundamentally wrong. But there's something powerful in recognizing that our worst experiences sometimes create the conditions for our best possibilities, if we respond to them with resilience rather than permanent bitterness. That night, as Julia slept beside me, I found myself reflecting on the entirety of the journey. Dave had betrayed me professionally, orchestrating my firing and blacklisting through manipulation and misrepresentation. I had methodically rebuilt, eventually achieving a position that allowed me to ensure appropriate consequences for his actions. The balance had been restored. But the true victory hadn't been watching Dave lose his position or struggle professionally. It had been transcending the betrayal entirely, building a life so fulfilling that his actions had become irrelevant rather than central to my story. The betrayal and subsequent restoration had taught me valuable lessons. The importance of documentation and evidence over office politics, the power of methodical focus on results rather than reputation, the recognition that professional relationships require vigilance without becoming paranoid. But most importantly, it had eventually led me to understand that defining oneself by past injustices, even when rightfully addressed, creates its own form of limitation. True freedom had come not from revenge or even restoration, but from creating a life where the betrayal became merely one chapter in a much larger, richer story. A story defined by creation rather than reaction, connection rather than isolation, and forward movement rather than circular return. He had gotten me fired and blacklisted. 3 years later, I had become his boss's boss, and he had become jobless. But 5 years later, I had become something far more significant, a person whose identity and fulfillment were no longer defined by that sequence of events at all. And that was the most complete victory imaginable.